And it is this world of politicking that is so questioned today here in Greece, as ordinary people ask of the political setup, well, what has gone wrong? How have you let us down? And this mirrors the situation in England today, where we too have had to ask our political establishment, where have you let us down? How come you have let us down? And the question of political action, political representation, political involvement becomes central to our thinking, in order that we should define it in ways that take on board the notion of the anti-political again. Against politicking, then, we have the notion of the anti-politics as keeping at bay the idea of the state, state politics, and big government. Now, this might sound almost as if it is Dave Cameron putting forward the Conservative Party manifesto in England. He too is speaking about against big government, rolling back the state, echoing Mrs. Thatcher, and opening up to what he calls big society, society against government and state. And he is, of course, borrowing from the thinkers that Barack Obama turned to in order to replace the notion of civic courage, civic enthusiasm, civic comradeship and friendship, and civic civilities, if I can underline it in the spirit of the triple exclamation mark, that this idea of extending and rolling out civil society, a society of conversation, of intimacy, of exchange, of embodied swapping of ideas, of voluntary activity, of self-organizing forces, of DIY and cooperative action, that this domain of the anti-political as civil society becomes the important question for us to ask as we accuse the political systems of their politicking and, as it were, exploitation of their privileges in the political sphere, and in that situation letting down, as it were, the people that they were meant to govern, in the name of whom they were meant to govern. How would one draw what I call the politics of the unpolitical? What map would one find? I find I would have to start at Tolstoy, at Leo Tolstoy, and move to his great admirer and the person who, having read Tolstoy's great book, The Resurrection, Mahatma Gandhi, the next figure in the map. Beyond Gandhi, Martin Luther King in the United States. Beyond Luther King, the genealogy would turn to Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and Mandela and Gandhi's history meet in South Africa, in Durban, across 21 years when Gandhi lived in the city of Durban. It crosses over the Atlantic with the slave transportations till we come to the great liberation theologists of South America, particularly of Brazil. So in this totally different genealogy, which I would like a work of art really to articulate, and that would be Philip Glass's work, Satyagraha, or non-violence, or the anti-political, in which he examines through the most beautiful operatic form and cadences and and sonic phrasing in Sanskrit, the whole of an imagined world and an actual world of resistance and civility against, as it were, the big government politics from top down onwards. Can such a world of anti-political be thought out? Is it possible in civilizations or societies that have a large, mountainous, monumental history sitting, as it were, above them? I mean the Acropolis. I mean the work that we see in Costas Douzinas' work yesterday and two colleagues of mine from Sweden, Cecilia and Magnus, discussed this with me for a moment, this rather interesting work called How One Can Think in the Shadow of a Temple. Can one think with the great weight of the archaeological sediments of history, philosophy, thought, that, as it were, gathers around the mountain of the Olympics and its monuments? How could one begin to think with them, and yet, in a sense, completely independently, in which thinking starts off from scratch, as it were, from the moment of encounter, from the moment of civil exchange? We arrive at instigation B. Can we have the courage to think through what we mean by a dirty cosmopolitanism today? The idea of a dirty cosmopolitanism first appeared in the Weimar Republic, in Germany of the 20s, and the experiments of this period, and in Wilhelmine and Weimar, and the experimental thinking of this time came to an abrupt halt with the rise of the National Socialists, and with the rise of Nazism, of course. The redescription of the world in terms of tribes, clans, and territoriality meant that the great experiment of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the great African-American theoretician and sociologist who arrived and lived in Berlin in the early part of the last century, who wrote a novel eventually to articulate what he felt sociology couldn't and his philosophical writing couldn't, a novel called The Dark Princess of India, in which the line appears, the Congo is flooding the Acropolis. The notion of the flooding of the Acropolis would mean the arrival of the dark migrations through which a new constitution of the world begins, a new mapping of the world begins. In Weimar, a much the similar idea was expressed in the work of A.B. Warburg, who, after 27 years, while he was incarcerated almost in this mental clinic, developed a deep desire after 27 years to want to reunite with the people, with the native and aboriginal tribes and clans of North America with whom he had met in his early and youthful visits. There he uses the phrase Athens and Oravi. So we have these motifs which project to us the notion of the most unlikely and apparently implausible connections, translations, transformations, and transmutations between parts of the world which at first do not seem to have anything in common. In the notion of the dirty cosmopolitan, and this comes out of my research in the University of Munich, where we are working on the post-Western modernities with Ulrich Beck, I felt again in the speed dating session, I was touched by Christine, is it, from Recife, who said, I do not want to be isolated, I want to be connected. And it reminded me, of course, of the phrase that precedes a passage to India by Forster, where he says, only connect. The wisdom we arrive at is only connect. Connect with all and connect in a way which transforms. This idea of linking, exchanging, creating residencies in different parts of the world. In many ways, I do think that artists and curators have been ahead of the game in wanting to step out of the container of the national territory in order to connect very different parts of the world amongst artists and practices. But the dirty cosmopolitanism, more strictly in sociological theory, starts off from the observation that we live today in a world that is deeply interdependent. We can see how the crisis here in Greece provokes a chain reaction across the Mediterranean and beyond, right through the countries of the world. and in fact demands responses, even in countries that feel that they are comfortably off, but in order to protect that comfort, need to intervene and support and connect with Greece today.